There's a peculiar kind of silence that descends upon those who have ventured too far into the mystery. It's not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something far more profound, a recognition so complete, so utterly transformative, that the world you once knew becomes transparent, like a stage set viewed from backstage. Terence McKenna understood this phenomenon intimately, this strange exile that comes not from being cast out, but from seeing through. He spoke often of the mushroom, of DMT, of ayahuasca, but what he was really describing was something far more unsettling. The irreversible nature of gnosis, the terrible gift of seeing what cannot be unseen. Imagine for a moment that you've spent your entire life watching a movie, completely absorbed in the narrative, identifying with the characters, feeling their joys and sorrows as your own. Then suddenly, inexplicably, you become aware of the screen itself. You see the projector's light cutting through the darkness. You notice the theatre walls, the exit signs, the other viewers still lost in the story. You can no longer pretend you don't see these things. The movie continues, but you're no longer in it. You're watching yourself watch it, and this meta-awareness creates a distance that can never again be fully collapsed. This is the predicament of the awakened observer, the one who has passed through what McKenna called the crucible of transformation. And here's what nobody tells you in those glossy spiritual magazines or weekend workshops. There's no going back. Not really. Oh, you can try. You can attempt to resubmerge yourself in the consensus trance, to forget what you've learned, to pretend the veil wasn't lifted. But it's like trying to believe in Santa Claus after you've found the presents hidden in your parents' closet. The innocence is gone, replaced by something else, something that feels simultaneously like wisdom and exile. McKenna was fascinated by this threshold, this point of no return. He would speak with a mixture of enthusiasm and melancholy about the territory beyond the familiar, about the domains revealed through psychedelic exploration, through deep meditation, through the earnest pursuit of truth wherever it might lead. He recognized that the very tools that liberate consciousness also isolate it, because they carry you into regions where language fails, where the shared assumptions of culture dissolve, where you find yourself utterly alone in a way that has nothing to do with physical solitude. The truth, and McKenna was relentless in his pursuit of it, is not a comfortable thing. It doesn't arrive wrapped in reassuring platitudes or convenient belief systems. It comes more like a demolition, systematically dismantling the structures you thought were reality itself. Your identity, a narrative construction, your personality, a carefully curated fiction, the solid, objective world, a consensus hallucination, agreed upon, but no more real than a dream from which we haven't yet awakened. These aren't metaphors. These aren't poetic exaggerations. This is what reveals itself when you look deeply enough, and McKenna spent decades reporting back from these investigations like an explorer sending dispatches from a continent that appears on no map. But here's where it gets interesting, where the real challenge emerges. When you see this, when you really see it, not intellectually, but experientially, in the cells of your body and the fabric of your awareness, you don't graduate into some blissful state of permanent transcendence. Instead, you find yourself in a kind of liminal space, neither here nor there, unable to fully return to the world of appearances, yet still having to navigate it, still having to pay rent and make small talk and pretend that the concerns of the sleeping world are your concerns too. McKenna called this the felt presence of direct experience, and he was precise in his language. Felt, not thought about, not believed in, but viscerally known. Presence, not a memory or a concept, but something immediate and unavoidable. Direct experience, unmediated by culture, language, or the filtering mechanisms of consensus reality. Once you've had this, once you've touched the thing itself, rather than merely the description of it, you become a stranger in your own life. Not because you've become strange, but because you've seen that what everyone else calls normal is itself profoundly strange, a collective agreement to ignore the fundamental mystery in favor of a shared delusion of understanding. This is not despair, though it can feel like it. This is not nihilism, though it shares some of its characteristics. This is something else entirely, a kind of cosmic homesickness, a longing for a place you can't return to because you've realized it never existed in the first place. The comfort of ignorance, the security of unexamined beliefs, the social warmth of shared illusions, these are forfeit, and in their place, something vast and strange and utterly impersonal, something that doesn't care about your happiness or your preferences, something that simply is, with a presence so overwhelming that all your carefully constructed meanings crumble before it like sandcastles before a tide. McKenna understood that this journey, once begun, develops its own momentum. It's not something you do, it's something that happens to you, something that uses you as its instrument. The psychedelics, the meditation, the philosophical inquiry, these are just doorways, and once you've stepped through, you can't unfind the door. You can close it certainly, you can turn away, but you'll always know it's there, and that knowledge changes everything. It's like learning that your entire neighborhood is built on top of a vast underground ocean. The houses still stand, the streets still function, but you can never again forget what lies beneath, supporting and threatening in equal measure. And so begins the peculiar loneliness that McKenna spoke of, though perhaps loneliness isn't quite the right word. Isolation might be closer. Singularity. The recognition that your experience, your seeing, is fundamentally incommunicable. You can describe it certainly. You can use metaphors and analogies. You can write books and give lectures, as McKenna did prolifically. But the thing itself, the actual seeing, remains locked within the vault of your own consciousness, untransferable, unshareable, a treasure and a burden carried in perfect solitude. Consider the structure of ordinary consciousness. We move through the world in a kind of consensus trance, agreeing without discussion on what's real, what matters, what constitutes a valid experience. This agreement is invisible until you step outside it, and then suddenly it becomes glaringly obvious. A vast, intricate dance of mutual confirmation, everyone reflecting everyone else's reality back to them, creating through this reflection a stable, solid-seeming world. It's not unlike what happens in a theatre. Everyone agrees to forget it's a performance, and through this collective forgetting, the performance becomes temporarily real. But what happens to the person who can no longer forget? What happens when the curtain becomes transparent? When the machinery of illusion reveals itself? You find yourself in a strange position. You must continue to participate in the dance, because there's nowhere else to go, no alternative reality waiting to receive you. But you participate now, with full awareness of the dance's arbitrary nature, and this awareness creates an unbridgeable distance between you and those still lost in the movement. McKenna experienced this acutely. Listen to his lectures, read his books, and you'll hear it. A thread of profound alienation running beneath the humor and the intellectual pyrotechnics. He was a man who had seen something, and having seen it, could never quite return to the world of unseeing. He became a translator, attempting to render the ineffable into language, knowing full well that the translation was always inadequate, always a betrayal of the original experience. But he tried anyway, compulsively, brilliantly, because what else could he do? Silence was not an option. The vision demanded expression, even if that expression was doomed to fall short. This is the first stage of the awakening paradox. You see something that changes everything, but the world doesn't change with you. The revelation is yours alone, and while it feels like the most important thing that could possibly happen, while it seems like something that should transform reality itself, it doesn't. Reality continues exactly as before. The mystery deepens, but the mystery has always been there. What's changed is not the world, but your perception of it, and that change, however seismic it feels internally, leaves no mark on the external landscape. The deeper you go into this recognition, the more you realize that awakening is not a destination, but a process of continuous disillusionment. Each layer of understanding reveals another layer of complexity beneath it. McKenna was particularly eloquent on this point. He never claimed to have arrived at some final truth, never presented himself as an enlightened master who had solved the cosmic riddle. Instead, He positioned himself as an explorer in territories that grew stranger the further he ventured into them. And this honesty, this admission of ongoing bewilderment, is perhaps what made his work so compelling. He would often speak about the alien quality of deep psychedelic space, how it presents itself not as an extension of human consciousness, but as something genuinely other, something that challenges our most basic assumptions about the nature of mind and reality. And he was right to use that word, alien. Because what you encounter in these depths is not a more refined version of what you already know, not a clarification of familiar themes, but something that defies categorization entirely, something that seems to come from outside the human frame of reference. This is where the loneliness intensifies. Because if you've touched something genuinely alien, something that doesn't fit into the categories provided by culture or language, or even ordinary consciousness, how do you share that? How do you convey an experience that has no reference points in common experience? You can't. Not really. You can gesture toward it. You can create elaborate metaphors. You can try to evoke through poetry what you cannot capture in prose. But the experience itself remains incommunicable, locked away in the private chamber of your own awareness. And here's the thing. This incommunicability is not accidental. It's not a failure of language or a limitation of human understanding, though it's both of those things. It's also structural, inherent to the nature of the experience itself. The mystery McKenna explored is not something that can be objectified, packaged, and transmitted from one mind to another like information. It's not data. It's not content. It's a transformation of the very apparatus of perception, and such transformations can only be undergone individually, can never be borrowed or received second-hand. This is why all the spiritual traditions ultimately point beyond themselves. This is why every genuine teaching ends by destroying itself, by admitting its own inadequacy. The map is not the territory, as McKenna liked to quote, and what he was mapping, or attempting to map, was territory that actively resists mapping, that changes its topology the moment you try to fix it in place. It's not that the territory is unknowable, but rather that it can only be known in a particular way, directly, immediately, through your own unrepeatable encounter with it. So you find yourself in possession of something precious and useless, a truth that transforms you but cannot be given away, a seeing that isolates even as it illuminates. And this is not a bug in the system, this is the system itself. The awakening is necessarily lonely because it's necessarily individual. There's no collective enlightenment, no group transcendence. There are only singular consciousnesses, each finding its own way through the labyrinth, each making its own discoveries in the secret chambers at the center. McKenna understood this, and yet he spent his life trying to bridge the unbridgeable, trying to create a language for experiences that exist beyond language. This might seem like a contradiction, but it's actually the most honest response to the dilemma. You can't transmit the truth, but you can inspire others to seek it themselves. You can't give someone your awakening, but you can suggest that awakening is possible, that there are techniques and practices and substances that can catalyze the transformation. You become not a teacher, but a provocateur, not a guide, but a fellow traveler reporting back from the edge. And what are these reports? What is the content of the message that returns from the depths? It varies, of course. Each explorer brings back their own version, colored by personality and culture and the specific circumstances of their journey. But there are common themes, patterns that repeat across accounts. The dissolution of the ego, that sense of being a separate, isolated self. The recognition of interconnection, the fundamental unity underlying apparent diversity. The encounter with intelligence that seems autonomous, other, not reducible to your own unconscious processes. The sense of meaning and purpose inherent in the cosmos itself, not imposed from outside, but woven into the fabric of existence. These are not new insights. Every mystical tradition has reported variations on these themes for thousands of years. What McKenna added was a contemporary voice, a modern sensibility, and most importantly, a willingness to take seriously the most radical implications of these experiences. He didn't try to domesticate the mystery. didn't attempt to make it comfortable or compatible with consensus reality. He let it remain strange, alien, challenging, and in doing so, he honored its actual nature rather than forcing it into familiar shapes. But this honoring comes at a cost, and the cost is precisely this loneliness we're exploring. When you refuse to dilute the strangeness, when you insist on the full weirdness of what's been encountered, you separate yourself further from those who haven't had the experience or who have had it, but chosen to normalize it, to file it away under familiar categories. You become a voice in the wilderness, literally, crying out about visions in the desert while everyone else is concerned with the affairs of the city. McKenna often spoke about the importance of community, about finding your tribe, those rare souls who have also ventured into the depths and returned, changed. And such communities do exist. Loose networks of psychonauts and mystics and reality hackers, people who recognize in each other the telltale signs of having been to the edge and looked over. But even within these communities, the essential solitude remains. You can share the fact of transformation, but not the transformation itself. You can confirm for each other that something profound has occurred, but each person's profound occurrence is unique, unrepeatable, untransferable. This is the second stage of the awakening paradox. The experience that seemed like it would connect you to everything instead sets you apart. The unity consciousness you touched revealed the interconnection of all things, but the very act of touching it individuated you in a new way, made you singular in your seeing. You're both more connected and more alone than you were before, more connected metaphysically perhaps, but more alone socially, culturally, practically. And there's no resolution to this paradox, no synthesis that reconciles the contradiction. You learn to live in it, to inhabit the tension between unity and isolation, between the cosmic and the personal. You develop what might be called a double consciousness, the ability to function in the world of appearances while remembering that it's appearances, the capacity to take seriously what needs to be taken seriously, while knowing that ultimately none of it is as solid or final as it seems. McKenna had this double consciousness in abundance. He could discuss the DMT elves with utter seriousness, while simultaneously maintaining a kind of ironic distance, a humor that suggested he knew how absurd it all sounded. He could make grand claims about the nature of reality, while admitting that he was guessing, theorizing, trying to make sense of experiences that might not make sense, that might be designed not to make sense in the way we usually understand sense-making. This intellectual humility, combined with experiential boldness, is rare. Most people who have profound experiences either become true believers, convinced they've figured it all out, or they retreat into skepticism, deciding it was all just brain chemistry and delusion. McKenna did neither. He maintained the tension, held the paradox, allowed the mystery to remain mysterious, while still taking it seriously as something worthy of investigation, contemplation, integration. But holding this tension is exhausting. It requires you to constantly navigate between worlds, to code switch between languages, to be simultaneously in and out of consensus reality. You can never fully relax into either position. You can't retreat completely into the mystic vision because you still have to live in the world, still have to deal with practical concerns and social obligations. But you also can't fully embrace the world's priorities because you've seen through them, recognized their provisional and arbitrary nature. This is the loneliness at its most acute, not the loneliness of physical isolation, but the loneliness of perspective, the solitude of seeing. You're surrounded by people, engaged in relationships, participating in society, but there's a part of you that's always elsewhere, always remembering something that others have forgotten or never knew. It's like being the only person in a room who remembers a crucial event that everyone else has somehow erased from their memory. You can't forget, but mentioning it seems crazy, so you learn to carry it silently, this knowledge that separates you from those around you. McKenna carried this burden with remarkable grace, turning his isolation into a kind of mission. If he couldn't come back, if the truth had exiled him from consensus reality, then he would at least send messages, dispatches from the frontier, invitations for others to make the journey themselves. He became a cartographer of spaces that resist cartography, a linguist of experiences that transcend language, a scientist of the subjective. What makes McKenna's approach particularly valuable is his insistence on the reality, the ontological validity of what's encountered in altered states. This wasn't just interesting psychology, wasn't merely the brain playing tricks on itself. It was, he argued, contact with genuine otherness, with dimensions of reality normally hidden from ordinary consciousness, but no less real for being hidden. This is a radical claim, and it's precisely this radicalism that makes his work both compelling and dangerous. Dangerous, because once you accept the possibility that these experiences reveal actual features of reality rather than merely subjective hallucinations, you can no longer maintain a comfortable relationship with the default world. If the DMT space is real, if those entities are genuinely autonomous intelligences rather than projections of your own psyche, then what does that say about the nature of reality? What does it imply about consciousness, about death, about the limits of scientific materialism? These questions aren't academic. They're existential in the deepest sense, and they can't be answered from the safety of theoretical speculation. They demand investigation, exploration, direct experience, and that's where the point of no return comes in. Because once you've undertaken that investigation seriously, once you've had your own encounters with whatever is out there or in there or beyond there, you can't unknow what you've learned. The genie won't go back in the bottle. The cat is irreversibly out of the bag. McKenna described the psychedelic experience as the most general of the knowledge-gathering activities, suggesting that it provides access to information that can't be obtained through ordinary means. But information is the wrong word, really. It's too neutral, too abstract. What you encounter is more like a presence, an intelligence that communicates not through language, but through direct transmission, through a kind of knowing that bypasses the usual channels of cognition. And this knowing, once received, can't be rejected or forgotten. It becomes part of you, transforms your understanding from the inside out. This transformation is what creates the loneliness. Not because you're now different from others. Everyone is different. Everyone is unique. But because your difference is of a particular kind. You've seen something that can't be unseen, and that seeing has altered your relationship to everything else. It's as if you've discovered a new color, one that doesn't exist in the normal spectrum, and now you see it everywhere, woven through the fabric of reality. But when you point it out to others, they think you're speaking metaphorically or making things up. The philosopher William James wrote about noetic quality, the characteristic of mystical experiences whereby they feel profoundly meaningful, conveying knowledge that seems more real and certain than anything learned through ordinary channels. McKenna experienced this noetic quality intensely and repeatedly, and he took it seriously. He didn't dismiss it as a trick of neurochemistry or a pleasant illusion. He treated it as data, as evidence of something genuine, even if that something defied conventional understanding. But here's the challenge. Noetic quality is inherently private. It convinces you, the experiencer, but it can't convince anyone else. You can describe what you learned, you can report on the insights you received, but the felt sense of absolute certainty, the overwhelming conviction that you've touched truth itself, this can't be transferred. And without that felt sense, your reports sound like just another belief system, just another story someone is telling about the nature of reality. So you end up in a peculiar position, utterly convinced yourself, but unable to convince others, and aware that from the outside, your conviction might look like delusion. This requires a certain kind of courage, the courage to trust your own experience even when it contradicts consensus reality, even when it isolates you from the mainstream of human discourse. McKenna had this courage in spades. He was willing to sound crazy, willing to be dismissed, willing to occupy the fringe, because he valued truth over respectability. And maybe that's the key to understanding the loneliness of awakening. It's not that you're rejected by others, though that sometimes happens. It's that you've rejected a certain kind of comfort, the comfort of agreement, the ease of thinking what everyone else thinks. You've chosen, or been chosen by, something else, something that demands your allegiance even as it sets you apart. And once you've given that allegiance, once you've committed yourself to following the truth wherever it leads, you can't go back to the comfortable lies, the convenient fictions, the shared delusions that make social life smooth and easy. McKenna often spoke about the archaic revival, his vision of a culture that would reintegrate the shamanic wisdom of our ancestors, that would take seriously the revelations available through plant medicines and altered states. But he also knew that such a revival would require a massive shift in consciousness, a willingness to abandon the security of scientific materialism and rational skepticism. He knew, in other words, that what he was proposing was not a minor adjustment, but a complete reimagining of what we think we know about reality. And he knew from personal experience how difficult such a reimagining is, how it demands everything from you, how it can leave you stranded between worlds, too weird for the straight world, too grounded for the purely mystical, unable to find a comfortable position anywhere. This is the price of exploration, the cost of pushing against the boundaries of the known. You don't get to make the journey and then return unchanged. You don't get to see the truth and still enjoy the comfort of illusion. The entities McKenna encountered in his psychedelic explorations, particularly the self-transforming machine elves of DMT space, seemed to him to be genuinely autonomous, genuinely other. They weren't, he insisted, products of his imagination or symbols emerging from his unconscious. They were inhabitants of another dimension, another realm of being, and they had their own agendas, their own messages, their own reality independent of his perception of them. This is a staggering claim, and it's worth sitting with its implications. If consciousness can access domains populated by non-human intelligences, if the psychedelic experience is genuinely exploratory rather than merely introspective, then our entire cosmology needs revision. The universe is not dead matter, accidentally giving rise to isolated pockets of awareness. It's alive throughout, teeming with consciousness at every level, and what we call ordinary reality is just one channel among many, one frequency in a vast spectrum of possible experiences. But accepting this revision means abandoning the worldview you were raised with, the metaphysics that structures Western culture, the assumptions that make modern life make sense. It means becoming an exile from your own civilization, a citizen of a reality that your culture doesn't acknowledge. And this is not a metaphor. This is actual cultural displacement, actual alienation from the dominant paradigm. You become a stranger in a strange land, and the land is your own society, your own historical moment, your own species' current consensus about what's real. McKenna navigated this displacement by creating his own space, his own context, largely through his lectures and writings. He built a community of listeners who were interested in these questions, who had their own experiences with the unusual and unexplained, who were willing to entertain radical possibilities about the nature of consciousness and reality. But even within this community, he remained singular, unique in his particular combination of erudition, imagination, and experience. And perhaps this is the ultimate message about awakening. It doesn't lead to a place where everyone is awakened in the same way, where some final truth is universally recognized and celebrated. It leads instead to a recognition of irreducible diversity, of the necessity of individual exploration, of the impossibility of second-hand enlightenment. Each person must make their own journey, have their own encounters, draw their own conclusions. The truth cannot be franchised, cannot be mass-produced, cannot be reduced to a formula that works for everyone. This is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means you're free to explore, free to question, free to follow your own curiosity into whatever strange territories it leads. Terrifying because it means you're alone in that exploration, fundamentally and irreducibly alone, unable to rely on anyone else's map or anyone else's authority. You have to trust your own experience, your own discernment, your own capacity to navigate without a guide. McKenna trusted his own experience with a kind of fierce integrity. He reported what he saw, what he learned, what seemed to him to be true, without worrying too much about whether it fit into acceptable categories. He was a trickster in the best sense, playful, provocative, willing to say the unsayable, willing to think the unthinkable. But beneath the playfulness was deadly seriousness, a commitment to understanding that drove him to take risks most people would never consider. And the risks weren't just physical, the dangers of powerful psychedelics, though those are real enough. The risks were also psychological, social, spiritual. The risk of going so far out that you can't find your way back. The risk of encountering something so alien, so other, that it shatters your categories of understanding. The risk of becoming so strange to yourself that you no longer fit anywhere, no longer have a stable identity to return to. These risks are not advertised in the glossy brochures of the wellness industry, not mentioned in the mainstream conversations about mindfulness and consciousness. They're the dark side of awakening, the shadow that accompanies illumination. Because light creates shadows, and the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. When you shine awareness into the hidden corners of reality, when you illuminate what has been carefully kept in darkness, you discover things that perhaps were meant to remain hidden, or at least were hidden for good reason. McKenna spoke about this paradox often, the way that knowledge can be both liberating and oppressive, the way that seeing clearly can be both a gift and a curse. He didn't romanticize the psychedelic experience or pretend that it was always pleasant. He acknowledged the terror, the overwhelming strangeness, the moments of existential vertigo when everything you thought you knew dissolves into chaos. He was honest about the difficulty of integration, the challenge of bringing back what you've learned and finding a way to live with it. And this honesty is perhaps his greatest legacy. In a field full of hype and hyperbole, where every experience is presented as transcendent and transformative, McKenna was willing to admit that sometimes it's just confusing, sometimes it's frightening, sometimes it leaves you more bewildered than you were before. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't claim to have solved the mystery. He was simply reporting from the front lines of consciousness, describing what he found there as accurately as he could, knowing that his descriptions were inadequate, but offering them anyway because silence seemed like a worse option. This brings us to a crucial point about the loneliness of awakening. It's not that you become isolated from others, though that can happen. It's that you become isolated from your former self, from the person you were before you saw what you've seen. There's a discontinuity, a break in the narrative of your life. The person who entered the experience is not the same as the person who emerged from it, and this creates a strange kind of internal alienation, a sense of distance from your own history. You remember being that person, the one who didn't know, but you can't fully inhabit that perspective anymore. It's like remembering childhood. You have the memories, but you can no longer experience the world the way a child does. The innocence is gone, replaced by knowledge, and while knowledge has its own value, its own dignity, there's also a loss, a nostalgia for the simpler world you used to inhabit. McKenna experienced this acutely. He would sometimes speak with a kind of wistfulness about the ordinary world, about the simplicity of lives lived without the burden of cosmic questioning. But he also knew there was no going back, that once you've asked certain questions, you can't unask them, and once you've received certain answers, you can't pretend you never heard them. The path only goes forward, into increasing complexity, increasing strangeness, increasing distance from the default human experience. And what is that default human experience? It's a kind of managed amnesia, a collective agreement to forget the fundamental mystery in favor of practical concerns. We get up, we go to work, we pay our bills, we maintain our relationships, we pursue our goals, and all of this is built on a foundation of unexamined assumptions about what's real, what matters, what life is for. These assumptions are necessary for social functioning, for psychological stability, for the smooth operation of civilization. But they're also a kind of sleep, a hypnosis, a trance state that we mistake for waking consciousness. The awakening that McKenna described is a rude arousal from this trance. It's not gentle, not gradual. It's sudden, shocking, disorienting, like being shaken awake from a deep sleep by someone shouting that the house is on fire. And when you wake up, you realize that yes, in a sense, the house is on fire. Everything you thought was stable and permanent is actually in flux. Everything you thought was solid is actually made of vibrating energy. Everything you thought was separate is actually connected in ways that ordinary consciousness can't perceive. This realization doesn't make practical life impossible, but it does make it strange. You continue to function, continue to participate, but there's always a part of you that's watching, that's aware of the arbitrary nature of it all, that sees through the social fictions to something vast and mysterious underneath. And this awareness, this double vision, creates a permanent sense of displacement, of not quite belonging anywhere. McKenna dealt with this displacement through intellectual work, through constant exploration and articulation. He turned his outsider status into a vocation, became a professional weird person, someone whose job was to think the strange thoughts and say the unsayable things. But not everyone has this option. Most people who have profound awakening experiences have to find ways to integrate them into otherwise ordinary lives, have to figure out how to be both awake and asleep, both in the world and outside it. This integration is perhaps the hardest part of the journey. The experience itself, however intense, is temporary, but the knowledge it leaves you with is permanent, and you have to find a way to carry that knowledge without being crushed by it, without becoming so alienated from ordinary life that you can no longer function. You have to develop what might be called a practiced schizophrenia, the ability to hold multiple contradictory realities simultaneously, to be simultaneously cynical and sincere, detached and engaged, enlightened and embodied. McKenna was a master of this practiced schizophrenia. He could discuss the most abstract metaphysical concepts while also being deeply practical, grounded in the physical world. He loved food, loved nature, loved the sensory richness of existence, even as he questioned the ultimate reality of material existence. He didn't use his mystical insights as an excuse to check out of life, to become otherworldly and disconnected. Instead, he used them to see life more clearly, to appreciate its strangeness and beauty more fully. But this appreciation comes tinged with sadness, because once you've seen the impermanence of it all, once you've recognized the dreamlike quality of existence, you can't fully lose yourself in it anymore. There's always that observer, that witness, that part of consciousness that stands back and watches the drama unfold, knowing it's a drama. And this observer, this witness, is necessarily alone. It can't merge with what it's observing. It can't dissolve back into the dream. It's condemned to awareness, to seeing, to knowing. This is the loneliness at its most fundamental level, not social loneliness, not psychological isolation, but ontological solitude. The basic aloneness of consciousness itself, the fact that awareness is irreducibly singular, that each of us is locked into our own private experience with no direct access to anyone else's inner world. Normally we don't feel this too acutely because we're distracted by the contents of consciousness, by the stream of thoughts and sensations and emotions. But in deep states of awareness, when the content quiets down, what remains is just that bare fact of being, that simple I am that can't be reduced to anything else, can't be explained away, can't be shared. McKenna touched this level of experience repeatedly in his psychedelic explorations. He described encounters with what he called the transcendental object at the end of time, a kind of strange attractor pulling all of consciousness toward it, a teleological principle organizing the evolution of complexity. But he also encountered, again and again, the fundamental solitude of the self, the irreducible singularity of individual consciousness. And he never fully resolved the tension between these two insights, between the vision of cosmic unity and the experience of radical individuation. Maybe the tension can't be resolved. Maybe it's built into the structure of consciousness itself, this paradox of being simultaneously one with everything and utterly alone, simultaneously connected to the cosmos and trapped in the prison of individual perspective. The mystical traditions speak of transcending the ego, dissolving the self, merging with the absolute. But they also acknowledge that there must be someone who has the experience, some locus of awareness that undergoes the transformation. You can't have an experience of no self without a self to have the experience. This logical paradox mirrors the existential paradox of awakening. You can't see the truth without there being a you to see it, But the truth reveals that the you is itself a construct, a fiction, a temporary eddy in the flow of consciousness. So what are you left with? A strange loop, a self-referential system that can never quite grasp itself, that exists in the very act of trying to understand its own existence. McKenna loved these kinds of paradoxes. He wasn't interested in neat solutions or comfortable answers. He was interested in the complexity itself, in the irreducible strangeness of being, in the way that every answer generates new questions, every resolution creates new mysteries. He had what might be called an appetite for the ineffable, a hunger for experiences that exceeded the capacity of language to capture them. And this appetite drove him into territories where most people fear to tread. Not because he was reckless or foolish, but because he had a kind of intellectual courage that's rare, the courage to follow an idea all the way to its conclusion, even when that conclusion is disturbing or destabilizing. He was willing to let his worldview be shattered, if that's what the evidence demanded. He was willing to be wrong, to be confused, to be lost in territory that had no maps. This willingness is essential for genuine exploration. If you approach the mystery with too many preconceptions, if you need your discoveries to fit into comfortable categories, you'll never encounter anything truly new. You'll just find confirmation of what you already believe, reflections of your own assumptions. But if you can approach with genuine openness, with a willingness to be completely surprised, then you might encounter something authentic, something that genuinely challenges and transforms your understanding. But this openness has a cost. It means accepting uncertainty, living with ambiguity, tolerating the discomfort of not knowing. Most people can't sustain this for long. They need answers, need closure, need to believe they understand. So they take their experiences and file them away under familiar labels, or they create elaborate belief systems that explain everything, or they simply forget, let the memory fade until the experience loses its disturbing edge. McKenna refused all these comfortable options. He let the mystery remain mysterious. He created theories and models, certainly, but he held them lightly, was always willing to revise them in light of new experience. He understood that the map is not the territory, and that the territory he was trying to map was one that actively resisted mapping, that changed depending on who was looking at it and how they were looking. This brings us to one of McKenna's most important insights, the role of language in constructing and constraining reality. He understood that we don't just use language to describe the world, we use it to create the world, to bring into being the very reality we then think we're merely describing. Language is not a neutral tool for representation. It's an active force that shapes perception, that determines what we can see and think and experience. And if language creates reality, then by changing our language, we can change our reality. This was the promise McKenna saw in the psychedelic experience. Not just that it revealed different realities, but that it revealed the constructedness of reality itself, the way that what we call the world is actually a linguistic and conceptual edifice built on top of something far more fluid and ambiguous. The psychedelics, he argued, don't distort reality. They dissolve the habitual distortions through which we normally perceive reality, revealing the raw, unfiltered strangeness underneath. But here again, we encounter the problem of communication. If you've seen this strangeness, if you've had the direct experience of reality's fluidity and constructed nature, how do you convey that to someone else? How do you use language to point beyond language? How do you use concepts to indicate the inadequacy of all concepts? This was McKenna's constant struggle, trying to say what can't be said, trying to teach what can only be learned through direct experience. He developed a remarkable vocabulary for this purpose, drawing on sources as diverse as alchemy, shamanism, cybernetics, and chaos theory. He created neologisms, coined phrases, used metaphors and analogies with wild abandon. His language was itself psychedelic, consciousness manifesting, reality creating, designed to jar listeners out of habitual patterns of thought. He wasn't trying to convey information in the conventional sense. He was trying to induce a state, to create through language something analogous to what the psychedelics created through chemistry. And for those who could tune into his wavelength, this worked remarkably well. His lectures became legendary in certain circles, not because they explained things clearly, but because they evoked something, catalyzed something, opened doors that people didn't know were there. He had a shamanic quality in this sense. He wasn't teaching doctrine. He was performing a kind of verbal magic, using words as tools to alter consciousness. But this only worked for those who were already primed for it, who had their own experiences of the strange and unusual, who were looking for confirmation that they weren't crazy, that there really was something more to reality than the default world acknowledges. For everyone else, McKenna probably just sounded like a brilliant eccentric, entertaining perhaps, but not to be taken too seriously. And this brings us back to the central theme, the loneliness of seeing what others don't see. Because even when McKenna found his audience, even when he was speaking to rooms full of people who hung on his every word, he was still fundamentally alone with his vision. The experience he was trying to convey remained his, untransferable, locked within the privacy of his own consciousness. He could inspire others to seek similar experiences, could validate their own strange encounters, but he couldn't give them his eyes, couldn't make them see exactly what he saw. This is the loneliness that comes not from absence of connection, but from the impossibility of complete connection. You can love someone, can share your life with them, can communicate with them constantly, and still there remains this unbridgeable gap between consciousnesses, this fundamental privacy of experience. And when the experience in question is already far outside the normal range of human experience, when it's something that most people would consider impossible or delusional, that gap becomes a chasm. McKenna was acutely aware of this chasm. He knew that even his most devoted listeners couldn't fully understand what he was talking about without having their own equivalent experiences. He knew that his words were at best provocations, invitations, pointers towards something that had to be discovered individually. And he knew that many people who heard him would dismiss him, would file him under entertaining but unreliable, would enjoy the intellectual pyrotechnics without taking seriously the underlying message. But he kept speaking anyway, kept writing, kept trying to communicate the incommunicable. Why? Perhaps because the alternative, silence, seemed like a betrayal of what he'd learned. Perhaps because he felt a responsibility to those who came after, to leave some kind of map, even if he knew the map would be inadequate. Perhaps because the experience of the mystery generated its own momentum, demanded expression the way a work of art demands to be created. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps he just needed to talk about it, needed to put it into words even if the words failed, because the experience was too overwhelming to carry silently. Perhaps the lectures and books were as much for him as for anyone else, a way of processing and integrating experiences that threatened to overwhelm his ability to make sense of them. Whatever the motivation, the result was a body of work unlike anything else in contemporary culture, a sustained attempt to articulate the utterly strange, to make respectable the disreputable, to take seriously what our culture has systematically dismissed. McKenna gave voice to experiences that usually remain private, hidden, unacknowledged. He made it possible for others to speak their own truths, to admit their own strange experiences without fear of being labeled insane. This is no small contribution. In a culture that has pathologized altered states, that has reduced consciousness to brain chemistry and dismissed mystical experience as delusion, someone needed to stand up and say, no, these experiences are valid, they're important, they reveal something genuine about the nature of reality. McKenna did this with intelligence and eloquence, with humor and humility, and in doing so, he created permission for a whole generation of explorers. But he also paid the price for this public stance. He was marginalized, dismissed by mainstream academia, relegated to the fringe. His ideas were considered too weird, too unscientific, too unconstrained by conventional methodology. And while he found an audience outside the academy, while his lectures drew hundreds and his books sold well, he never achieved the kind of mainstream respectability that might have come if he'd been willing to tone down his message, to make it more palatable, to pretend that the psychedelic experience was just interesting psychology rather than genuine contact with other dimensions. He wouldn't do that. He couldn't do that, because to dilute the message would be to betray the experience, and the experience had been too powerful, too profound, too undeniably real to be explained away or reduced to something comfortable and familiar. He had to tell the truth as he understood it, even if that truth made him seem crazy, even if it isolated him from the mainstream of intellectual culture. This is the cost of authenticity when your authentic experience is radically at odds with cultural consensus. You can have community or you can have conformity, but you can't have both. You can be true to your vision or you can be acceptable to the mainstream, but you can't be both. McKenna chose truth over acceptability, and he lived with the consequences of that choice: the marginalization, the dismissal, the sense of being a voice crying in the wilderness. But here's what's interesting. The wilderness is not empty. There are others there, other voices, other explorers, other people who have also chosen the path less traveled. McKenna found his people, eventually, not in the halls of academia or the centers of power, but in the psychedelic underground, in the festivals and gatherings where people come together to share their strange experiences and validate each other's reality. These communities exist in the gaps of mainstream culture, in the spaces that don't appear on official maps. They're invisible to those who aren't looking for them, but for those who are, they're vitally important. Places of refuge, places of recognition, places where you can speak freely without being dismissed or pathologized. McKenna became a kind of elder statesman in these communities, a voice of wisdom and experience, someone who had gone far and returned to tell the tale. But even within these communities, even among fellow travelers, the essential loneliness remained. Because each person's journey is unique, each person's experience is their own, and while you can find fellowship and mutual understanding, you can't escape the basic fact that consciousness is singular, that awareness is inherently private, that you're ultimately alone with your own seeing. This is not a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be accepted, a fact of existence to be integrated into your understanding. The loneliness doesn't go away. It gets deeper, more subtle, more pervasive. But it also becomes less painful, less of a burden, as you realize that it's not a personal failing or a sign that something has gone wrong. It's just the nature of individual consciousness, the price of having a unique perspective on reality. McKenna seemed to make peace with this loneliness, to accept it as part of the package. He didn't rage against it or try to escape it. He incorporated it into his worldview, understood it as a necessary consequence of being a conscious, aware, individual being. And in accepting it, he transformed it, not into something else, but into something he could work with, could use as motivation for his explorations and articulations. There's a profound teaching hidden in this acceptance, that the goal of awakening is not to escape loneliness, but to see through its meaning, to recognize that the self that feels lonely is itself part of the illusion, part of the constructed nature of reality. If there's no separate self, if consciousness is ultimately unified, then who is it that's lonely? Who is it that feels isolated and alienated? These are not rhetorical questions. They point to something real, something that can be investigated through meditation, through psychedelics, through any practice that allows you to examine the structure of consciousness itself. And what you find, if you look deeply enough, is that the sense of being a separate self is itself a construction, a habit of thought so deeply ingrained that it seems like an ontological fact. McKenna explored this territory thoroughly. He reported experiences where the ordinary sense of self dissolved completely, where the boundary between inner and outer collapsed, where consciousness expanded to include everything or contracted to a single point of awareness without attributes. These experiences suggested that our usual sense of being a located, bounded individual self is not the final truth about consciousness, but rather one possible configuration among many. But, and this is crucial, even after such experiences, the sense of self returns. You come back from the ego death or the unity consciousness, and there you are again, apparently separate, apparently individual, apparently lonely. So what does it mean? Was the unity illusory? Was the dissolution just a temporary neurological state? Or is the return to selfhood the illusion, a reconstitution of familiar patterns after a brief glimpse of the way things actually are? McKenna didn't claim to have definitive answers to these questions. He had theories, hunches, speculations based on his extensive experience. But he was honest about the limitations of his understanding, about the ways in which each experience raised as many questions as it answered. He understood that the mystery doesn't yield to interrogation, doesn't give up its secrets just because you ask nicely or look carefully. It remains mysterious, and perhaps it must remain mysterious. Perhaps mystery is its essential nature. This brings us to another aspect of the loneliness of awakening, the loneliness of uncertainty, of not knowing, of having to live with profound questions that have no satisfactory answers. Our culture is uncomfortable with uncertainty. We want experts to tell us what's true, scientists to explain how things work, authorities to provide definitive answers. But in the realm McKenna explored, there are no experts, no definitive answers, no authorities who can tell you what to think or believe. You're thrown back on your own resources, your own judgment, your own capacity to navigate without a map. And this is lonely, not because you're physically alone, but because you're epistemologically alone. Alone in your knowing, alone in your uncertainty, alone in your attempts to make sense of experiences that resist sense-making. But again, this loneliness can be transformed through acceptance. If you stop fighting it, stop trying to escape it, stop looking for some authority or system or teaching that will take away the burden of uncertainty, then the loneliness becomes something else. It becomes a kind of freedom, a recognition that you're not bound by anyone else's version of reality, not constrained by conventional wisdom or mainstream assumptions. This is the freedom that McKenna embodied and advocated for. The freedom to think for yourself, to trust your own experience, to follow your curiosity wherever it leads. It's a dangerous freedom, certainly. Dangerous because you might be wrong, might be deluded, might be lost in solipsistic fantasy. But it's also the only real freedom there is, the only alternative to blindly accepting what you're told by culture, religion, science, authority. McKenna was a champion of this radical epistemological individualism. He didn't want followers or disciples. He wanted fellow explorers, co-investigators, people who would take responsibility for their own consciousness and conduct their own experiments. He provided tools, suggestions, frameworks for understanding, but he never claimed to have the truth in any final sense. He was too intelligent for that, too aware of the provisional nature of all knowledge. And this brings us to a final aspect of the loneliness we've been exploring, the loneliness of responsibility. When you take full responsibility for your own consciousness, when you refuse to outsource your authority to external sources, you're alone in a new way. You can't blame anyone else if you make mistakes. You can't hide behind tradition or convention or what everyone else believes. You stand naked before the mystery, armed only with your own awareness and whatever wisdom you've managed to accumulate. This is terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Terrifying because you might fail, might stumble, might choose wrongly. Exhilarating because you're fully alive, fully engaged, fully present to your own existence in a way that most people never experience. You're not sleepwalking through life, not following a script, not playing a role that was written for you. You're improvising, creating your path as you walk it, discovering what's possible through the act of exploring. McKenna lived this way, as an improviser, an explorer, a creator of his own path. He didn't fit into existing categories. He wasn't quite a scientist, though he approached his investigations scientifically. He wasn't quite a philosopher, though his work was deeply philosophical. He wasn't quite a mystic, though mysticism was central to his experience. He was McKenna, sui generis, a category unto himself. And this too is part of the loneliness, becoming so unique that no existing label fits, becoming so individual that you can't be easily classified or understood. But again, this is not a bug, it's a feature. It's what happens when you take seriously the imperative to be yourself, to discover and express your own unique perspective, rather than conforming to pre-existing templates. The world needs this kind of individualism, this kind of originality. Not because everyone should be like McKenna, that would be its own kind of conformity, but because genuine diversity, genuine pluralism, requires that each person fully inhabit their own unique being, contributes their own irreplaceable perspective. If everyone is just repeating what they've been told, just following the scripts they've been given, then we lose the richness that comes from genuine multiplicity of viewpoints. McKenna understood this. He celebrated diversity, championed the strange and unusual, encouraged people to explore their own idiosyncratic paths rather than following his. He knew that the psychedelic experience, properly understood, doesn't produce uniformity, but rather explodes into endless variety, that each person who ventures into altered states discovers something unique, something that reflects their own consciousness, meeting the mystery on its own terms. But this means that each explorer is ultimately alone with their discoveries, unable to rely on anyone else's map or anyone else's wisdom. You have to find your own way, make your own mistakes, draw your own conclusions. And while communities of fellow explorers can provide support and confirmation, they can't do the work for you. The journey is necessarily solitary, and the loneliness is necessarily part of the package. So we return, finally, to our starting point. The recognition that awakening, far from connecting you with everything, sets you apart in a fundamental way. Not because you're better or more evolved or more enlightened than others, but because you've seen something that can't be unseen, and that seeing creates an unbridgeable distance between you and those who haven't seen it. McKenna lived in this distance, made it his home, turned it into a productive space for investigation and creativity. He didn't pretend the loneliness wasn't there. He acknowledged it, accepted it, worked with it. And in doing so, he transformed it from a burden into a gift, from a problem into a resource, from isolation into a kind of fierce independence that allowed him to speak truths that needed speaking. The truth that he saw, that he couldn't come back from, is simply this. Reality is far stranger, far more mysterious, far more alive than our culture acknowledges. Consciousness is not a product of matter, but fundamental to existence. The universe is not dead stuff, accidentally giving rise to awareness, but rather awareness all the way down, expressing itself in infinite forms. And we, each of us, are that awareness, temporarily localized, temporarily individual, but ultimately connected to the vast consciousness that pervades all things. This is both the most connecting and most isolating truth you can know. Connecting, because it means you're never really separate, never really alone, always part of the larger whole. Isolating, because it means you see what others don't see, live in a reality that others don't acknowledge, carry knowledge that can't be shared in any direct way. And so you learn to live in both worlds, the world of appearance and the world of reality, the world of society and the world of truth, the world of connection and the world of solitude. You develop that double consciousness we spoke of earlier, that ability to be simultaneously engaged and detached, committed and free, social and solitary. This is what McKenna did, what he demonstrated through his life and work. He showed that it's possible to live with this paradox, to embrace the loneliness without being destroyed by it, to speak the truth without requiring that others believe you, to explore the mystery without needing to solve it. And perhaps that's the final teaching, the ultimate message from beyond the veil, that the loneliness of awakening is not a problem to be fixed, but a reality to be lived, that the distance it creates is not a wound, but a vantage point, that the exile it brings is not punishment, but liberation. You won't want to come back, not because it's so pleasant on the other side, it's not necessarily, but because you can't. The door only opens one way. The knowledge can't be unknown. The seeing can't be reversed. And so you go forward, into the loneliness, into the strangeness, into the vast mystery that has no end and no resolution. You go forward because there's nowhere else to go, because the path only goes in one direction, because once you've started asking the real questions, you can't stop until you've followed them all the way to their inexplicable end. This is what Terence McKenna did. This is what he taught, through example rather than doctrine. And this is what awaits anyone who ventures far enough into the mystery. The recognition that you're alone, yes, but alone with something vast and beautiful and utterly strange, something that makes the loneliness not only bearable but somehow necessary, somehow right, somehow exactly what was needed all along.